would somebody make up a Messiah, specifically the Messiah, who was crucified? It's important to understand what Jews meant. Paul was a Jew. It's important to understand what Jews meant by the term Christ. In the days of Paul, there were some Jews who were expecting that a Messiah was going to come to the Jewish people sent from God. God would send a Messiah. The word Messiah actually comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach, which means anointed one. Messiah is the same word as the Greek word Christ. The Hebrew word is Messiah, Greek word Christ. Jews had various expectations of what this Messiah would be, the anointed one. This is a term that was originally used in Jewish scriptures to refer to the king of Israel. He was the anointed one. When the king was anointed at his coronation ceremony, like King David, King Solomon, this showed that God was putting his favor upon him. In Jesus' day, there hadn't been a king on the throne for nearly 600 years. Some people thought there would be a king on the throne, and they called him the anointed one, the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be a great warrior figure like David, a great warrior who drove out the enemy and set up God's kingdom by establishing a throne in Jerusalem, and Israel would once more be a sovereign state that would rule over its enemies. That's what the Messiah would do. Some Jews thought that the Messiah would be a cosmic figure who would destroy the forces of evil and set up God's kingdom on earth, a mighty cosmic judge. There were various expectations of what the Messiah would be, but there was one thing that all of the expectations had in common. Jews who expected a Messiah expected a great, powerful figure who would destroy the enemy and set up God's kingdom. And who was Jesus? The Christians said that Jesus was a crucified criminal. If you wanted to make up a story about the Messiah, would you make up the story that the Messiah had been crucified? That's the opposite of what the Messiah is supposed to be. If you want to make up a story about a Messiah, you'd make up the story that, well, he actually drove out the Romans and he is sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. Why didn't they make up that story? Because it obviously wasn't true. The early Christians were not going around saying that God had been crucified. They were saying that Christ had been crucified. Well, why did they do that? If it didn't make any sense to expect a crucified Messiah. It was because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that he got crucified. You can't explain the crucified Messiah as something that was made up. The crucified Messiah is because people thought Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that this man had been killed as a crucified criminal.
I seriously do not care if Jesus existed or not. Because when I'm talking about Jesus, I'm not talking about the magic guy who walked on water and who's the figure of Christianity. I'm talking about a Jewish preacher called Yeshua, because Jesus is just the English version of a Latin version of a Greek version of that Aramaic name, which was a fairly common name at the time. So I'm talking about this guy Yeshua. He seems to have come from Nazareth. He seems to have preached a kind of an apocalyptic end of the world message, got crucified. Either he thought he was the Messiah or his followers came to think he was. He then got deified over a period of about 50 years after his death, and he's now a figure of a major religion. But the Jesus I'm talking about is a Jewish preacher, of a kind of which there were many at the time. So if someone were to turn around and show me some new evidence, I doubt this is going to happen, but if some new evidence were to appear that proved to me, or showed to me, not proved, that showed pretty clearly that it's unlikely he existed, I'd just shrug and say, okay, fair enough. I don't care, right? So I don't believe in anything to do with Christianity. Or if someone were to present a new version of the mythicist position based on the current material, the current evidence that we have, that is more convincing than what I've seen from, say, Robert Price, Earl Doherty, or Richard Carrier, then I'd say, shrug and say, okay, no problem. And so I've had a lot of conversations with mythicists about why they have come to that conclusion and why they, in some cases, cling to it with what could be only regarded as almost religious, dogmatic fervour. And I think you've nailed a couple of things there. Like one thing I have noticed, and this is a generalization but not a misrepresentation, there is a lot of overlap between those very fervent fundamentalist Christians. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that mythicism in that sort of that more dogmatic, extreme view is very comforting to people who have come from the opposite extreme. So people who have come from, it's all true, Jesus is Lord, everything in the Bible is literally true, everything in the Gospels actually happened. If you've come from that very, very extreme fundamentalist position, the exact opposite is a comforting replacement. It's none of it's true. Jesus didn't exist. It's all nonsense. There's nothing in there at all. Right? Now, first of all, it appeals, I think, to people with a particular type of psychology. It may be that it appeals to people who have been raised with that kind of absolutist thinking. It does seem to appeal to some people who don't like the ambiguity of humanity's subjects such as history, where you can't be absolute. You can't prove things finally. It's all about assessments of likelihood. There's lots of shades of grey, there's lots of ambiguity. So it appeals to people who come from, particularly from a very scientific background, who don't like that ambiguity, and mythicism takes that ambiguity away. It's all crap. So there's a lot of psychological stuff playing into why mythicism appeals. I also suspect that for many people, and this again is a generalisation, there's a degree of laziness. It means if you just say Jesus didn't exist, none of it is true, then all the work that you have to put in to work out which parts of it might be true and which parts might not be, which parts are later additions, which parts aren't, which is hard work. You don't have to do any of that. You can just dismiss it and just go, it's all crap, and move on. And I come across a lot of people who just, that's the appeal of mythicism. You can just brush the whole thing aside and get on with other stuff, like saying Christians are stupid, or creationism is wrong, or we should have wider separation between church and state. So, and this is not to say that any of these people are not sincere. I think they absolutely are. Of course they are. Some of them maybe a little bit too sincere. But I think once you go down that rabbit hole of I've got the truth and all the scholars are wrong, and particularly when you divide it into an us and them of Christians believe in a historical Jesus, non-believers don't, then it becomes this sort of binary. It becomes this sort of almost Manichaean binary. So I've had people say to me, well, you're an atheist, so why do you believe that Jesus existed? And I said, well, that's a non sequitur. I'm talking about a historical Jesus. Atheism is about believing in God. I don't believe in God, but I don't believe Jesus was God. I'm talking about a Jewish preacher. What's the problem? But they can't disentangle Jesus from Jesus Christ. They can't disentangle the historical Jesus from Jesus Christ. So there's a lot of psychological drivers going on here that I think is one of the reasons why mythicism has got some traction amongst atheists, despite the fact very few, and this needs to be emphasised, a tiny handful of genuine scholars actually accept it. Most scholars think it's a bad thesis.
I believe that there was a figure upon whom the Christian religion was built around. I don't think he's the most important figure in Christianity. He's certainly the most important figure of Christianity, but the most influential individual that would produce the religion we see today is not Jesus, but Paul. But I'm going to sidestep because that wasn't part of the question. There are many reasons why I think there probably was a historical figure in the first third of the first century that was probably running around saying that, the world as we know it, the empire is coming to a close, and and it's called an apocalyptic eschatology, that God is going to intervene in history. Apocalypse, it means revelation, and eschatology is from the Greek word eschaton, which means at the end. That means people are preaching the world's coming to an end. That was, in fact, if you were a preacher in the first half of the first century, and that was not a part of your message, you might as well stay home. But that was the kind of message that would probably get you killed. That's exactly why the Romans would want to get rid of you. The reason why I come down on the side of that there was a figure who was almost nothing to do with what we find in the Christian Bible, which is just embellishments of embellishment. But the reason why I feel that there was more likely than not a figure around whom all these embellishments were created is because of a few things that we're told about Jesus, that he would come from a city called Nazareth. I mean, he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. Now, of course, Matthew 2:23 is going to invent a fictitious verse that he shall be called a Nazarene. But I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in is who the heck would come up with Nazareth. So that's a feature that would, if you were creating a myth, you wouldn't include Nazareth. And I know there are mythicists who'll get angry at me, but archaeologists have discovered a very tiny area, really small area, really a one-horse town in the Upper Galilee, which they've identified as Nazareth. It's Nazareth, never mentioned in the Talmud, never mentioned Tanakh. It's just nothing. It's not in Josephus. It's so unimportant. Who would invent that? The other part is that the fiction in the Christian Bible points us in the direction that this person did exist, because the Christian Bible is working too hard in manufacturing, shaping plot devices that would be unnecessary if Jesus was fiction. That means there was no figure like that. For example, the effort that we find there in the entire Christian Bible, the only books that claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem is Matthew and Luke. There's a very strange dialogue in John 7 where it's very interesting that folks go, ask the question, but isn't the Messiah supposed to be born in Bethlehem? And John, whoever wrote this book, doesn't do anything to respond to it, leaves that just like hanging out there. So we only find Matthew and Luke that are making this assertion that Jesus was born of a virgin, only Matthew and Luke in their infancy narratives. And that's all they have in common. The infancy narratives completely contradict each other. When I say contradict, I don't mean this in a picayune manner. I don't mean like the contradictions we find in the Passion narratives, which are very elaborate, and I discuss extensively in Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. This is just two different stories, and they're not compatible with each other. The point is that whoever wrote the book of Matthew, it's not that he worked hard, because it's almost certain that Matthew was, whoever wrote this book, he doesn't identify who he was, whoever wrote what we call the book of Matthew was collating information. We know he was taking almost the entire book of Mark. We know he was taking another source that's been lost, we now call Q, incorporating that. And then he's taking oral information in his community, and I said his because women in the first century were almost certainly illiterate. So you can be virtually certain that all the writers were men. And then the family, now what Matthew has to do is, he's got a problem. Everybody knows Jesus from Nazareth. No one knows anything about Bethlehem. So he's got to figure out a way to get the family and Jesus to Nazareth. How does he do that? He wants him born in Bethlehem. Why? Because he wants Jesus to be born in the city that King David was born in. He's going to rip a passage of Micah chapter 5, verse 1 or verse 2 in the Christian Bible, corresponding to Matthew 2, verse 6. Here's the point. I could much more easily assemble a brief story about what was probably the historical Jesus like that would comport well with the first third of the first century, far better than if he didn't exist. that would create many, many problems, and there were many things in the Christian Bible that would be completely unnecessary. So that's why I believe he was a historical figure. But the Talmud doesn't help anybody, because the Talmud is not talking about the Jesus of Christianity. Talmud is talking about someone who lived during the Hasmonean period, which is essentially a period of about 100 years, and that comes to an end when Pompey enters Jerusalem in 66 to put down the rebellion, and then Rome is here, and goodbye.